He found out I lied to him through social media and then ruined my life.
I never thought one night out would change everything. But then he saw the photos, and now I feel like my entire life's falling apart. Hello, Reddit. First time posting here, and honestly, I never thought I'd be the kind of person to spill their relationship drama online. But here we are. I'm seriously at a loss for what to do. I've tried talking to him, tried explaining myself, but it's like nothing's getting through to him, and I feel like I'm watching everything slip away. I don't even know if anyone can help me at this point, but maybe just venting it all out here will help me make sense of it all. My name's Ashley. I'm 29, and I'm married to Jason, who's the same age. We've been together since college, and I always thought we were one of those perfect couples you hear about, strong, steady, and supportive. Jason has always been, well, kind of the perfect husband, if I'm being honest. He's always been the guy who's got my back, no matter what. He's supportive, incredibly loyal, and just so rational. Like, even in the toughest moments, Jason never lets his emotions take over. He's the kind of guy who's level-headed and calm about almost everything. That part of him, I used to love the way he was able to maintain such calm when a situation got tense, or when I, at times, overemphasized something silly. He was always the sensible one in the relationship throughout. Well, of course, we have quarreled as any two persons in love and in a relationship would. Jason can be a bit stingy at times, and when I'm wanting to go out and have some fun, cut loose a bit. That is where we differ most. I am more of the spontaneous type, the type that will drop everything at the blink of an eye and head out, while he is the complete opposite of me. Careful, realistic. He would rather spend a night at home than go outside, but we never let that come in the way we never let that come in between us. Looking back, maybe I took a lot of his patience for granted. He was always the one who'd bend first, who'd try to smooth things over even when we'd clash. It felt like he'd do anything to keep me happy. And yeah, I guess over the years I got used to that. I never thought one night out, just one random girls' night at a club, would be enough to shake the foundation of our relationship. But here we are, and I'm starting to wonder if I really understood him at all. So this night out had been planned for a while as a girls' night with my closest friends, just us unwinding and having fun like we used to. Life has been kind of stressful lately, with work, responsibilities, and honestly just the everyday grind. It felt like we all needed a break, something to shake off the routine and just let loose for once. As I began preparing, I felt this little rush of energy go through me. I chose this dress I've had for a while, but never really worn anywhere. It was daring. I admit I stepped out of my comfort zone, but for some reason it just seemed natural that night. It was indeed more on the revealing side, a little above thigh length, touching my body more than what I would have preferred. But I wanted to feel the confidence, at least the desire to be reckless. I had forgotten what dressing up like that felt like. That sort of confidence, As I looked in the mirror, I felt amazing, like a different version of myself. But in the back of my mind, there was this little voice saying, would Jason really be okay with this? I could almost picture his face, his eyebrows raising a bit if he saw me like this. He's always been a bit protective, maybe even conservative in his own way. He's the type to think that dressing too bold might send the wrong message. I knew he'd probably think it was a bit much, maybe even disapprove. But I brushed it off. I figured, it's just one night, just me and the girls. What's the harm? I didn't tell him about the dress, as I know that he would have something smart to say regarding it, and I wasn't willing to entertain that just yet. I just wished to be a normal person for a day where I don't need to convince anybody about anything or pretend to be someone else. Besides, I wasn't causing any harm, was I? I was just going outside to dance, to laugh, and to have fun with my friends. I had been waiting for this time since forever. As the night went on, I felt amazing. Every now and then, I'd catch people glancing my way, and it felt good. It felt like I was reclaiming some part of myself I'd lost over the years, that confidence, that boldness I used to have before life got so serious. It was freeing in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. In the back of my mind, I knew Jason would probably never see the dress, and honestly, I didn't think it would be a big deal even if he did. I wasn't hiding anything, but at the same time, I didn't want to deal with any talk about it, if that makes sense. I just wanted one night where I could forget about all that and just be me. So after the night out, I didn't think much of it. It was enjoyable, I came out delighted with the day, and for once did not have to care about anything else but me. The next morning, I woke up a bit drunk, looked through my phone, and I had all the typical messages, some pictures sent by friends during the night, and of course the tags on Facebook. My friend Sarah had posted a bunch of group photos from the night. You know, the ones everyone crowded together, some blurry shots of us dancing, and a few where we were all just laughing. In one of the photos, you could see me clearly in the dress. I mean, they were innocent photos, right? Just us girls having a good time. But then I noticed something. Jason had liked the post. I didn't really think much of it at first because he's friends with most of the girls. So it's not unusual for him to come across our stuff on Facebook. I figured he'd just scrolled through, saw us having fun, and clicked like without giving it a second thought. But then, this little voice in the back of my head started to wonder, had he really looked at the photos? Like really looked? I brushed it off quickly though. I mean, why would he care? We were just out, harmless fun, nothing wild. Besides, he was not one of those who could make fuss, much less over some photos that were posted in social media. So I left it and worried about something else, assuming there was no problem with it. But standing here, perhaps I should have understood then that this like wasn't just a pass. So when I got home later that day, everything felt off. Jason was there, sitting on the couch, scrolling on his phone like usual, but he didn't even look up when I walked in. Normally, he'd ask me about my day or crack some joke, but this time, nothing, just silence. It was weird, and I could feel this weird tension hanging in the air. At first, I didn't think it was about the photos. I mean, what was there to be mad about, right? But the longer the silence dragged on, the more I started to feel this little pit in my stomach. I tried to play it casual, asked him if he wanted dinner, but he just shrugged and said, "Yeah, sure," without even looking at me. That's when I knew something was up. Finally, as I was setting the table, he just came out with it. He asked, "So, why didn't you tell me about last night?" His voice was calm, but I could feel something beneath it. I tried to brush it off, acting like it was no big deal, and told him, "Oh, it was just a girls' night, nothing special." I laughed a bit, hoping it would lighten the mood, but he didn't smile. He just nodded, looking down at his phone. Then he queried, "And the dress?" Damn, that was the question that brought me to my knees. I did not think that he would be that direct about it. I instantly failed at this, said something like, "Oh, come on, it was just for fun, a little confidence boost, that's all." I could easily tell he was not happy with that kind of response. Jason just went quiet again, and it was honestly worse than if he'd just been mad. I mean, he wasn't yelling, he wasn't calling me out, he just looked hurt, and that was harder to handle. I tried to explain that it was just a one-time thing, that I wanted to feel good about myself for a night, but every word I said just seemed to make him retreat further. Eventually he straightened up, grinned, and told me, "You know, Ashley, I don't mind if you go out with friends. But why didn't you feel that we could sit and discuss it with me, or that you had to conceal the dress from me?" That one stung, because at some level I realized he was correct. I used to make it a point to never reveal anything to him with the aim of never getting a reaction or starting a conversation. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there feeling this mix of guilt and frustration. Part of me wanted to defend myself, to tell him he was overreacting, but the other part of me knew that he had every reason to feel the way he did. He didn't say much else after that, just shook his head slightly and said he needed some space to think. And then he walked out of the room, leaving me there with all these unspoken things hanging between us. That night, the house felt colder and emptier than ever before, and for the first time, I started wondering if I'd really messed things up. After that night, well, they just weren't the same. This is when Jason began to distance himself in a way that I had never really witnessed before. Usually he was quite verbal, playful, or just plain nice, and talked on his own while we conversed. Now it is as if there is a glass that separates us. He didn't seem to want to acknowledge me. At best, he would answer in single words, and every time I would attempt to start a conversation, all I got was a grunt or a garbled response. At first, I told myself he was just processing it, that he'd get over it and things would go back to normal. But as the days went by, that distance only grew. It was like he was there, but not really there. I'd walk into the room and he'd just glance at me before looking away, like he didn't know who I was anymore. It was frustrating, and I didn't know how to handle it. I started trying little things to smooth things over, things I thought might help us reconnect. I made his favorite dinner one night, hoping he'd notice the effort, maybe crack a smile or at least say something. But he just ate quietly, thanked me at the end, and went back to scrolling on his phone without a second glance. It was like nothing I did mattered. I even tried to bring up funny stories from the past, things we'd usually laugh about together, but he barely reacted. It was as if he'd shut down completely, and I was starting to feel like a stranger in my own home. That's when the guilt started creeping in. I found myself lying awake at night, replaying everything in my head. I kept thinking, did I really do something so wrong? Was it just a dress? Or was there something more to it that I didn't see? I wanted to believe it was a harmless night out, just a silly decision. But seeing Jason like this made me question everything. I kept telling myself he'd come around, that he just needed time. But the longer it went on, the more isolated I felt. I didn't even feel comfortable reaching out to him anymore because every time I tried, it was like he'd already drifted a little further away. And the worst part was, he never once got angry, never raised his voice, never had that big confrontation where I could defend myself or even apologize properly. He just kept pulling away, and it was driving me crazy. When the world went to sleep, I began to doubt what I had done. Perhaps I should have revealed to him about the dress from the beginning, or perhaps I shouldn't have minimized the issue. But there always lingered a word in the back of my mind that stated in reality that I was the one who lost your trust, and I wouldn't know how it could be regained. All right, so here's where things get messy. And honestly, this is the part that's hardest for me to even admit. I guess it's time to be real, though, no matter how bad it makes me look. That night at the club, after a couple of drinks, things got a little out of hand. I didn't go out with any intentions of doing anything wrong. It was supposed to just be a fun night with my girls. But then, somewhere along the line, my judgment just slipped. There was this guy there, someone I hadn't seen in years. We used to be friends back in high school, and it was a surprise seeing him again. We started talking, catching up on old memories, and I don't know, it just felt easy, like we were back in those carefree days, just chatting and laughing. After a few drinks, though, things shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't just friendly reminiscing. He was complimenting me, saying how good I looked, how much I'd changed since high school. And I have to admit, it felt nice. It was flattering. With Jason being so distant lately, I think I just soaked it up without thinking. Then one thing led to another and we started dancing. I convinced myself it was harmless, just a little fun, but as the night went on, I started to realize it was more than that. At one point, he leaned in a little too close and I didn't back away. We didn't kiss, nothing like that, but it was close. Close enough to feel that rush of excitement, that feeling of crossing a line I shouldn't have crossed. I hate admitting it, but I felt seen, and in that moment, I didn't pull back. The whole thing lasted maybe a few minutes before I came to my senses, realizing how far it had gone. I laughed it off, said something about needing to get back to my friends, and walked away. But the feeling stuck with me, and I spent the rest of the night trying to convince myself it was nothing. Just a little harmless flirting that maybe went a tiny bit too far. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a silly moment that didn't matter. But even as I tried to brush it off, there was this nagging guilt gnawing at me. The next morning I felt awful, not in the I cheated kind of way, but just uncomfortable, like I knew deep down I'd crossed a line. I tried to bury it, convincing myself that it was all in my head, that I hadn't really done anything wrong. I mean, it's not like we kissed or anything, right? But still, that pit of guilt wouldn't go away. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to rewrite it into something less questionable. Then, a few days later, Jason got wind of it. I never thought until he described me how, until he sat me down and told me he knew about the night from our mutual friend. It seemed as if someone at the club recognized us and saw me with that guy, and then felt the need to tell Jason. Just my luck, right? I mean to tell you that of all the times that someone could be watching, it had to be that particular night. When Jason confronted me, I tried to play it off, to make it sound like it wasn't a big deal. I said it was just some harmless dancing, a couple of drinks, and that nothing happened. But he looked right through me. I could tell he already knew it was more than that he'd heard enough to feel betrayed. I tried to explain that it didn't mean anything, that I was just caught up in the moment, but he just sat there looking at me like he didn't even recognize who I was. For the first time in our entire relationship, he didn't say anything back. He just sat there, this hurt look on his face, as if he was processing it all, trying to decide if he could even believe me. And the silence? It was crushing. I wanted him to yell, to say something, anything, but instead, he just got up and walked out of the room. I felt like my heart had dropped out of my chest. I sat there alone with this wave of guilt crashing over me, realizing that maybe this wasn't something I could just brush off or justify. That moment, seeing him walk away like that, was like this gut punch. Like everything I'd been telling myself to make it okay suddenly shattered, and I was left sitting there with the reality of what I'd done. And for the first time, I started to understand that things might never go back to the way they were. I'd barely had time to process the whole thing when Jason came back. I'd been expecting, well, honestly, I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe anger? Yelling? Some kind of reaction that would let me defend myself, or at least explain things. But instead, he just sat down, calm, collected, like he'd made up his mind about something. There was this quiet determination in his face that I hadn't seen before, and it immediately made me nervous. Then he stared at me, and I could see the pain, but he did not shout at me. He did not ask for anything. He just said, "I need to tell you how disappointed I am." And that stung more than any yelling or finger-pointing that had ever been done in my direction. He said, "I can't believe that you did not tell me that you had something like that going on, that it has gotten this far." He stated that he assumed we have trust, and for him trust he could not imagine a better word. I tried to speak up, to apologize, to tell him that it wasn't as bad as it looked, that it was just a mistake, but he held up his hand, gently but firmly. "Ashley, I need time to think about this," he said. "I don't know if I can stay here right now. I need space." I was stunned. Jason was always the one who'd calm things down, who'd find a way to work through issues together. The thought of him needing space or time to think was the last thing I expected. I felt this panic rising in my chest, and I tried to tell him it was a mistake, that it didn't mean anything. But he just looked at me, quiet and steady, and said, "That's not the point. You kept this from me. You let it happen, and you didn't think it would affect us. I need to figure out if I can move past this." I felt like I'd been slapped. His words cut deeper than anything else. I'd never seen him so composed and distant. He explained that he'd be staying with his brother for a while. He needed to clear his head, he said, to decide what he wanted. The calmness in his voice was chilling. There was no anger, no outbursts, just disappointment, and it was somehow so much worse. I tried to hold on to his arm, pleading with him, but he gently pulled away and told me he'd be back when he was ready to talk. And then he left, just like that. The door closing behind him felt like this final blow, and I just sat there feeling completely hollow. This was Jason, the guy who'd always been by my side no matter what, the one who'd support me, listen to me, even forgive me when I'd mess up. And now he was gone, just like that, leaving me with nothing but silence. I tried calling him a few times over the next couple of days, but he didn't pick up. I left messages, texts all saying the same thing, that I was sorry, that I'd made a mistake, that I was willing to do anything to make it right, but he never responded. That's when it really hit me how serious he was about needing space. In a way, I think I kept expecting him to come back, to calm down and realize it wasn't worth all this. But that didn't happen. He stayed gone, and that silence grew heavier with each passing day. I felt like I was drowning in my own guilt, wondering if I'd just lost the one person who'd always stood by me. It felt so surreal the time he didn't go ballistic, didn't raise his voice or do something outrageous. It just felt very palpable, like it wasn't something he would just one day wake up and decide he doesn't feel like having women in his life anymore, and that scared me. Thus I saw that I did not appreciate him and thought he would still be there waiting for me, and he would always forgive me regardless. But now, when he distances himself, I realized how much pain I've inflicted on him. I started questioning everything. Why did I even let things get that far? Why hadn't I just told him about the night out? But it was too late for those questions. All I could do was wait, hoping he'd come back, that he'd forgive me, that somehow we could find a way to fix this. But the longer he stayed away, the more I started to understand that maybe things were broken in a way I couldn't fix. And the worst part, I had no one to blame but myself. After Jason left, the silence in the house was unbearable. I could feel the weight of everything, like this crushing emptiness filling every corner. I'd never felt this alone, and the worst part was knowing it was all because of me. I kept replaying that night in my head, wishing I could take it back, wondering how I let it all get so out of hand. Every memory of him, the little things, the laughter, even the quiet moments just made it all hurt more. I tried calling him the next morning, desperate to hear his voice, to just fix it somehow. I left voicemail after voicemail, pouring out apologies, telling him how sorry I was, how I'd do anything to make things right. But there was no response. I sent texts trying to explain myself, trying to make him see that it was a mistake, that it didn't mean anything. But all I got back was silence. It was like he'd vanished, and that silence just tore me apart. A few days later, I even went to his work, hoping that maybe if he saw me, he'd listen. When I showed up, he was always polite. That's Jason, but he kept his distance, just like he'd done when he first found out. There was no anger, no raised voice, but his eyes looked tired, hurt, in a way I'd never seen before. I tried to talk to him, to apologize in person, but he just told me he needed time and walked away. That moment broke me, realizing that he was genuinely that hurt. I'd never seen him pull away from me like that. The days turned into weeks, and it was like every time I reached out, he only withdrew further. The more I tried to explain, the colder his responses got. There was no yelling, no accusations, just this polite, distant response that felt so final. And it hit me. This wasn't just a temporary thing. He wasn't coming around like I'd thought. He was really hurt in a way that I couldn't just apologize my way out of. I kept thinking about how I'd taken him for granted all these years, assuming he'd always be there, that he'd always forgive me no matter what. But now, faced with this distance, I started to realize that maybe he wasn't coming back. And the thought of that was terrifying. The idea that I might have pushed him so far that he couldn't forgive me, that I'd lost him for good. It was like this slow, painful realization creeping in. I'd lie awake at night, scrolling through our old messages, rereading the little things he used to say, all those moments I'd brushed off, thinking they'd always be there. And now they weren't. I wanted to take it all back, to undo every choice that led to this, but all I could do was sit there staring at my phone, hoping that maybe he'd respond, that he'd give me some sign that things could go back to the way they were. But every day, that hope got smaller, and the guilt, it just kept building, twisting inside me until I didn't know what to do with it. It felt like I'd shattered something precious, something I'd never be able to fix. And now all I had was this emptiness, a silence that felt like it would never end. After weeks of silence, Jason finally agreed to meet me. I remember feeling this surge of hope, mixed with a pit of nerves so deep I could barely breathe. I kept thinking that maybe this was it. Maybe he was ready to talk things through and give us another chance. I showed up early, fidgeting with my hands, rehearsing all the things I wanted to say, every apology, every promise. When he walked in, he was calm, composed, the same way he'd been that night he left. He sat down across from me and took a deep breath, looking at me with those steady eyes that used to make me feel so safe. But this time, all I felt was dread. He told me in the calmest voice that he'd been thinking a lot about everything. He said he'd realized he'd lost something he didn't know if he could ever get back, his trust in me. And without that trust, he couldn't see a future for us. My heart dropped, and I started to panic, trying to convince him that we could work through it, that I'd do anything to make it right. But he just shook his head, that calm, steady resolve never wavering. Then he told me he'd already filed for divorce. He said he needed to move on for his own sake. Hearing those words, it was like the ground fell out from under me. I tried to hold back tears, begged him to reconsider, told him I'd change, that I'd be better. But he just looked at me, hurt but resolute, and said, "Ashley, it's too late." At that moment, I knew it was over. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just finality. He stood up, told me he hoped I'd find my own peace, and then he walked away just like that. I sat there for a long time after he left, numb, trying to process what had just happened. Jason, the one person I thought would never leave, was gone, and there was nothing I could do to bring him back. Update. It's been a few months now since everything went down, and honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. I ended up moving back in with my parents. Adjusting to single life again has been harder than I thought. Going from sharing every part of your life with someone to suddenly being alone, it feels like there's this empty space that I just don't know how to fill. I've had a lot of time to think about everything, and looking back, I can see just how badly I messed up. I took Jason's kindness for granted, assuming he'd always be there, no matter what. I thought he'd never leave, that he'd just forgive and move on like he always did. But I pushed him too far, and now I'm facing the consequences of that. It's like I've been hit by this wave of regret that I can't escape, and I know I have no one to blame but myself. I used to think I was unhappy because Jason was too cautious or too reserved, but now I see that he was the steady, caring person I needed, and I was too selfish to appreciate it. I wanted excitement, attention, and I thought a night out in a dress was harmless, but I crossed lines I didn't realize until it was too late. It's painful, realizing that I was the one who destroyed what we had. And Jason? He's completely moved on. I checked a few weeks ago, and he's even blocked me on all his social media. That hit me hard. It was like this final reminder that he's really done, that he doesn't want anything to do with me anymore. I guess that's his way of finding closure, and I can't blame him. He deserves to be happy, even if that means leaving me behind. So now, here I am, trying to figure out where to go from here. Every day feels like this endless cycle of regret and what-ifs, and I keep wishing I could go back and undo everything, but I know I can't. All I can do now is try to learn from it, try to be better, and hope that maybe one day I'll find a way to forgive myself, even if Jason never will. For anyone listening, take it from me. Don't take the people who care about you for granted, because once they're gone, there's no going back. Thanks for sticking with me through all of this. Honestly, I never thought I'd be here, sharing my story with strangers on the internet, but I guess I just needed a place to put it all out there. Maybe, in a way, I'm hoping to find some kind of closure, or at least understand how I ended up here. Part of me wants to believe that I was just caught up in a moment and made a mistake, but the other part knows it goes deeper than that. I know there's no taking back what happened, but maybe hearing your thoughts, your honest opinions could help me see things in a way I haven't yet. Was I wrong for wanting a night to just feel free? Or did I completely misjudge everything, thinking Jason would always be there no matter what? I still wonder if there was any way to save us, or if I just didn't deserve to keep him in the end. So what do you guys think? Did I deserve to lose him? Let me know in the comments. I'm open to hearing it all, good or bad. Thanks again for listening, and maybe, just maybe, sharing this will help me find some kind of peace I'm not sure if I'm looking for advice or just need to let it all out because if I'm being honest, this hurts to the bone. I never thought it would end like this. That I would be standing in the wreckage of everything that I have destroyed and realizing too late that I have hurt the person who loved me the most. It was supposed to be a simple lie, harmless sin, if there is anything like that. It was just a fleeting moment that had turned into something it was not supposed to. But somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that nothing will ever go wrong. I told myself I just needed to be careful. What I didn't know was that I wasn't just betraying my husband and I was betraying myself. And the moment I realized it was when the door slammed behind him. I'd been married to Michael for over 8 years. The man gave me everything, a roof over my head, all the comfort in the world, and a level of stability I had never known or even imagined before I met him. He was always the quiet one and the sort of person who made promises with actions, not words. But over time, I found myself restless and yearning for something I couldn't quite place. I felt my marriage life was boring and I needed some excitement or attention or something. It's not like James wasn't giving me attention, he was. He always did. He had all the time for me and that never changed, except that I changed. I wasn't supposed to be caught. We had planned it carefully, the times and places it would all happen. All of it was designed so Michael would never have to know. After all, why hurt him when he's never done anything wrong? But life doesn't follow plans, and I learned that the hard way. Fast forward to the day it all began. The day that led me down the wrong path. The day I wished never existed. So the thing is, Michael had always been proud of his friend from college. He'd tell me stories of a guy he used to know, the one he lost touch with as life pulled everyone in different directions. He talked about him with such admiration and how they'd been so close, and how he had been by his side through the wild ups and downs of youth. It was like he had finally reconnected with a part of himself, part of his past. He was not just an old friend, but he was someone my husband felt deeply connected to. So when this friend returned to the country and reached out to my husband, he asked me if we could invite over. I gladly agreed. I was really looking forward to seeing this man because of how well Michael spoke of him. So James came over and he brought stories of his own. He told us about the family he'd lost, the painful divorce he'd gone through, and the heavy responsibility he carried raising his son alone. It was a sad story and my husband wanted to be there for him, and honestly, I wanted to be there too. He didn't stay with us for a long time that day. He had gotten a call and had stepped outside to answer it. When he came back, his face seemed a little more serious and he had to rush out. So later that day, my husband stepped out to go get something and I was home alone. I just came out of the shower after preparing dinner. I came out feeling refreshed and was still in my robe and my hair was damp when the doorbell rang. I almost ignored it, thinking Michael would handle it, but then I remembered he was not around, so I tightened the robe around myself and went to answer. When I opened the door, I was taken back for a second. There was a handsome young man about 25 years old with a charming and confident grin. He was talking and well-dressed in a way that looked effortlessly enchanting, and yet somehow casual. He has that kind of youthful energy that was magnetic, and for a moment he just looked at me when his eyes lingered a bit longer than necessary. There was something in the way he looked at me, maybe interest, and that look kind of took me by surprise. It felt personal. Then he asked if this was the home of Michael's, and I answered yes, that Michael was my husband and if he was looking for him. I tried to sound more relaxed than I felt. He nodded and told me his father was here earlier and he had left some important documents behind and had asked him to come fetch it. That's when I realized he was James's son, that son he was telling us about earlier. I invited him inside and for some reason I felt oddly conscious of how I looked. I told him to make himself comfortable while I grabbed the document. When I returned, he was standing just by the doorway and looking at some photos on the wall. And he flashed that smile at me again as he took the documents I handed him. He told me the place smelled amazing and asked if I was cooking. I laughed and said yes, that I just wrapped up and if he would love to stay for dinner before leaving. He looked at me again, roaming his eyes over my body and before saying, he wouldn't mind if it meant having dinner with me, but he was in a hurry. Something in the way he said that, so easy, almost daring, made my stomach flip. The words were innocent enough, but his tone carried something more. something almost playful. And it was strange, but at that moment, I felt a bit flustered. I brushed it off and scolded myself silently. Here I was, grown and responsible and feeling a little too fluttery over some kid. But the way he spoke to me, the way he looked at me, it was like he saw me as more than just his father's friend's wife. I hadn't felt that thrill in years, and I found myself drawn in, even if it was just a passing moment. When he finally thanked me and stepped out, he threw one last look over his shoulder and said I should tell my husband he's got a lucky home. And with that, he was gone. I stood there for a second after closing the door. I was feeling a strange fusion of emotions. He'd made an impression, that much was certain, but I shook it off. What was I doing? Daydreaming about a 25-year-old kid? When Michael came home that night, I mentioned his friend's son stopping by to pick up the forgotten document. Nothing more, just the facts. But later, as I lay in my husband's arms, my thoughts kept drifting back to the young man's smile. His easy confidence and the way he'd mentioned he would love having dinner with me, as if he actually wanted to stay. Days passed and I brushed it off as a fleeting moment, but then James began stopping by more often. The more of his presence meant more of his son's presence. Every time his son came along, he'd make a point to linger, and he always finds small ways to flirt with me, with that same spark in his eyes. Sometimes it was a compliment on my cooking, other times a remark on my outfit or how I wore my hair. And each time I'd laugh it off, but his words would stay with me long after he left. I've met plenty of handsome young men before. Neighbors, colleagues of my husband's, and even family friends, but there was something different about him. It was like he knew exactly what he was doing, and each time he left me flustered in ways I hadn't felt in years, and somehow that thought just stuck with me, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. One weekend, James stopped by again, and he brought his son along for what seemed like just another relaxed afternoon. I was about to head out to pick up some groceries, and his son asked if he could tag along with his usual grin on his face. Before I could answer, he turned to my husband and his father, shrugging as if it were the most natural thing, and said he will help me with the bags and get the heavy stuff and make sure I get it all back home safely. The suggestion earned a chuckle from his dad, which stated it was a good idea, and my husband agreed, smiling. Michael and James were completely oblivious to the undercurrent I felt when James's son looked back at me. We headed out, and I tried to brush away my curiosity about him, and I'd been noticing his attention, and a part of me couldn't ignore it, but I told myself it was a harmless interest. Nothing serious, and I won't fall for that. At the grocery store, things started out light and easy. We wandered through the aisles and joked about products and swapped little stories. His energy was infectious, and I found myself laughing more than usual and letting my guard down. Then, as I reached up to grab something from a high shelf, he came up behind me, and his chest almost brushed my back as he reached over and took it down for me. The sudden closeness startled me, and when I turned to face him, he was already looking down and smiling, and his eyes were warm in a way that felt so comforting. Before I could think of what to say, he leaned forward and gave me a gentle kiss on the cheek, and his hand roamed around my arm just long enough to make my heart jump. I blinked as I was caught off guard. So I asked him what that was for, and he looked at me with the same relaxed smile as he held my gaze, and said he figured I wouldn't mind, and he wouldn't have it any other way. His voice was low and almost a whisper, and the way he said it made my breath seize. There was a spark between us. It was undeniable, and it was like an electric current in the air. It was a thrill that ran deeper than just attraction. We stood there, staring and getting lost in each other's eyes. The tension grew as we continued shopping, and every brush of his hand and every shared glance only made that thrill intensify. And it was intoxicating. And the thrill of walking along a line I never thought I'd cross came with a blend of anticipation and guilt. After we checked out and loaded the bags into the car, we found ourselves standing in the back corner of the store, and both of us were hesitant to leave. There was a restroom nearby, and he gestured towards it with a playful smile. I felt my heart race as I nodded and followed him, as if we'd both come to an understanding we never voiced out. Inside there, away from the curious eyes of the world, The magnetic pull between us became too much to ignore, and I found myself wrapped up in him, and our hands exploring each other, and our breaths mingled. Everything else blurred, including my husband, and all I could think about was the fun of it and the excitement of finally letting loose. The thrill and the freedom felt like an escape from the mundane sex with my husband. He was lost in the moment as I was. When we finally pulled away and reality settled back in, and the rush was replaced by emotions I couldn't quite name, the weight of what happened stayed with me as we drove back home. There was guilt, but there was also excitement. I kept replaying those stolen moments in the grocery store and the pleasure of stepping out of the lines I'd drawn so carefully for myself. Yet as I sat there next to him, the reality of what I'd done washed over me like a cold wave. Just as we pulled up to the house, I turned to him. I needed to set some sort of boundaries, even though a part of me didn't want to. I told him we have to keep this a secret and that it can't happen again, that I had done something I shouldn't have and it doesn't feel right. I watched his face and I was half hoping he would tell me he felt the same, but instead he looked at me with that calm and confident smile and nodded, like he understood but not quite agreeing. He said, "If that's what I want, he will respect it." And for a moment his eyes held mine and I felt that pull again, the same one I'd promised myself to ignore. But we both stepped out of the car and walked into the house as if nothing had happened. That evening, as I sat with my husband, I pushed down the path of guilt and told myself it was over. I'd crossed a line and I needed to leave it there. But even as I told myself that, I felt that memory and a part of me not willing to let it go. Days turned into weeks and I did my best to go back to my normal life. But every time my husband's friend and his son dropped by, I felt that tug, an invisible thread pulling me closer to his son, and each time, his son found a way to connect and slip me a glance, or a smile, or a brush of his hand when no one was looking. It was subtle, nothing that would give us away, yet every look and every moment became a part of an unspoken conversation, and each exchange was a feeling that kept me coming back for more. Finally, one afternoon, after exchanging flirty text messages and resisting the temptation of falling back into lust, I texted him. I couldn't hold back any longer, especially when he said he couldn't stop thinking about me because even I, too, couldn't stop thinking about him. We met somewhere discreet. We planned it in such a way that neither his father nor my husband would ever know. I'd told my husband I was heading out to visit a friend, and he trusted me completely and gave me no reason to think he suspected anything. When we met up, it was like stepping into another world, one where nothing was forbidden and I could indulge in every fleeting impulse I'd ignored for so long. Sometimes we would meet at a hotel and I'd stay over telling my husband I went to my mom's place. So our meeting became a routine, and each time I left the house, a voice inside my head reminded me that I was taking a risk, but I ignored it as long as it wasn't affecting my marriage. When I was with Michael, I poured everything into our time together and made an effort to be present and keep things the way they've always been. And during the few times Michael and I had an intimate moment, it was more than amazing and more fun because during those moments, I saw my affair's face instead of Michael, and I'd go wild and everything would turn out perfectly. It was strange, almost unsettling how easy it was to slip between two worlds. In one, I was a wife devoted and loyal and having great moments with my husband, and in the other, I was someone else, reckless and adventurous and indulging in something I could never admit to anyone. But even though I was able to keep it hidden, there were moments when I felt the weight of my actions, the moments that made me question who I was becoming. The thrill was intoxicating, yes, but I knew deep down that I was walking a dangerous path, one that could lead to consequences I wasn't ready to face. Even when I always replayed the memories whenever I was alone, I wanted to stop, but every time I told myself this was the last, I found myself drawn back. It was as if I was caught in a dance, the one I knew wouldn't last forever, but felt too good to give up just yet. I knew we didn't have a future together. He was a college kid, and I wouldn't want to lose my husband because of him. So I was highly careful. As long as no one knew, I was content to keep our secret hidden, and told myself that I was still in control, even as I felt myself slipping further into it. Then the worst day of my life happened. The morning started out like any other. Michael had told me that he'd be out for the day and returned very late at night, so he asked me to stay at home to sign for a package. My affair and I had already made plans to meet that day, so because of the package Michael asked me to receive, we had to rearrange and meet over at my place. It was just going to be a quick visit, and we'd part ways before the evening as if nothing had happened. When he arrived, I barely hesitated, and we moved upstairs to the bedroom where everything felt forbidden, but yet somehow tempting. We made love multiple times on me and James's matrimonial bed, and I didn't care about it because I had forgotten all about the life I'd built outside of this. After that, we cuddled and we talked deeply about everything. He told me he was in love with me and that we should elope together, but I told him I can't. I couldn't abandon Michael and the life I had here for something that should have been a fleeting moment, and he was sad and told me he would take care of me. I said no, and he asked what am I going to do about the pregnancy. I told him that I would handle it. He shouldn't worry, and that he should forget that ever happened, and everything about us. Maybe it's time for us to part ways, because with the way everything was going, I was scared we would get caught. And he said he won't, and he can't, that he would fight for me, that he loves me, and that's when I knew I had made the biggest mistake of my life. We were so caught in the conversation that I didn't notice when my husband opened the door and found us naked on the bed. Michael roared angrily, and we jerked up at the sound of his voice, and my eyes widened at the sight of him. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to rewind time, to undo everything that has led to this. His face was contorted with disbelief and a hurt I'd never seen before. His gaze bounced between the two of us like he was trying to make sense of something senseless. I became mute. I was short of words, and he said if this is what I've become and that I am not ashamed reducing myself to his level and insulting him. I wanted to speak, to explain, to say something that would lessen the blow, but no words came. Every excuse I'd planned to make if things ever go south vanished, and all I could do was stare and beat myself up mentally in regret. But then, before I could gather my thoughts, his anger shifted to my affair. He said he couldn't believe I'd sink that low. My affair looked at my husband with a smirk that only deepened the anger on my husband's face. He scoffed and said to Michael as he quickly grabbed his clothes and moved towards the door that Michael should mind his words. He wasn't low, and that if Michael had satisfied me the way a man should, I wouldn't have come looking for him. His words landed on me like punches. With a colder tone, he added, by the way, I got her pregnant too." Then he slammed the door and ran. My husband crippled on the floor. His eyes, once so full of love and trust, looked at me as though I was a stranger. As I sat there, the reality of what had just happened washed over me. I destroyed everything, shattered the foundation of trust and love we'd spent years building. I felt shame, guilt, and regret swallowing me whole. The thrill I'd chased now felt so distant and empty, and it was replaced by a hollow ache I knew would haunt me. I started crying and begging him, but he just stood up and left. I wanted to chase after him, to explain, to take it all back, but I knew that some things once broken could never be mended. What should I do? I know what I did was wrong, but I was going to end it. This is not how I expected everything to turn out. People make mistakes, right? I just wished I could make him unsee that. Update. I thought I had more time to fix it, more time to find a way out of this mess, to pretend I hadn't made the worst mistake of my life. But life doesn't wait for you to fix your mistakes. It doesn't give you the luxury of time to right your wrongs. No, it just comes at you full force, with no warning, and knocks you down when you least expect it. The truth is, I didn't know what love was until I lost it. Until I saw the man who'd given me everything walk out that door, without a single word. And in that moment, I realized that I never should have let my selfishness define who I was. I never should have let the idea of excitement lead me to ruin something so precious. I thought I was in control, but in the end, I was the one who lost everything. Michael threw me out of his home, and I cut ties with James' son and got rid of the pregnancy. I couldn't keep it. I couldn't accept the reality of it. I've always wanted to have a child, but not in that kind of a way. I tried my best to make it up to Michael, but he didn't want to hear anything. He said he felt betrayed and insulted, and I understood him because all he's ever done was love me, and I took it all for granted. I was foolish to think I would get away with everything. Now I am deep in regret. I received the divorce papers this morning because he couldn't bear being in a marriage with someone like me. And that's okay, except that I am not okay. I never wanted to lose Michael. He was my everything. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could turn things around and tell Michael how sorry I was, how much I regretted everything. But what I didn't realize was that words would never be enough to undo the damage I had caused. And now, I'm left alone with pieces of my broken heart. I hope someday I'm able to glue it all back because I'm not sure I can. Thanks for reading, Reddit. I feel so embarrassed and ashamed, but someday I'll hope to get over everything.